and welcome to my tiny shop in the corner of my garage. So today I'm going to be building a puzzle box that I designed myself. The idea for this box was that the end result would look like one solid block of wood with no noticeable lines, but that secretly there'd be a little button to push that would let you slide over one piece, then a couple other, which would finally unlock the box and allow you to lift the lid. So in order to accomplish this, it was important that each side of the box be made from one continuous grain of wood. So what you can see me doing here is using my shooting board to get each side to the correct width. I did this for each end, made sure that those were the same width, and then did it for the long sides as well. I'll show more of this later, but what I'll eventually do is rip cut each side 3 times, which will leave me with 4 pieces that will make up one side of the box. Here you can see on the paper the 4 pieces I'll eventually end up with. Before I could rip cut each piece, I decided it would be easier to cut my miters while each side was one block of wood, instead of cutting each side down into the 4 pieces I was talking about, and then trying to cut miters on each of the individual piece while trying to keep these all the same length. It just would have been a mess, and after doing it this way, I really think this was the wiser and better option, so I'm glad I went this way. Also, as an aside, if you've never used an angled shooting board before, I highly suggest you make one because they're a lot of fun to use and super satisfying to get nice, clean miters off of. Now that I had my miters cut, I could move on to my rip cuts. Because I wanted the end result to look like one continuous piece of wood, it was important that these rip cuts be super precise. Since I don't have a table saw or a bandsaw, which would have done this job perfectly, I created this magnetic rip cutting jig. Now the cut wasn't perfect and required a little cleanup on the shooting board, but the combination of the jig and the thin kerf of the Japanese saw made the end result look like the piece of wood had never been cut in the first place. I was really happy and kind of surprised at how this turned out. I repeated this process for each side of the box, and here you can see the 16 pieces that make up the 4 sides of the box. You can also begin to get a little idea of the complexity that's involved in this project. With all my pieces cut, I can now move on to cutting out the little push button. Don't really know what to call this little piece, so I'm just going to call it a push button because you can push it, and that's what I'm just going to go with. So I wanted to make this little push button, as small as possible to make it less noticeable. But in hindsight, I may have made it too small because it made working with it very tedious and very difficult. And I'm not sure that a bigger piece would have made it any more noticeable than the smaller piece I chose to go with. Regardless, I cut it out and wasn't as happy with the end result as I was with the rip cuts, because I felt like the continuous grain look that I was going for wasn't as nice and way more noticeable. I decided to press on though, and since I had made 2 cuts on one of the pieces, this made this piece smaller than the rest. So for the 2 long sides, I needed to take a couple passes on my miter shooting board to get the 2 long sides back to the same length. With the push button done, I could move on to working on the locking mechanism. I made the lock pieces out of maple in hopes that they would be as strong as possible. Strength was important here because the way the locking would work is that there would be a notch in the lock piece that would marry with a notch in the lid of the box. That way, when the notches were together, you couldn't pull the lid up, but if you slid one notch to the side, it would unlock it and allow you to lift the lid. I'll show this working in a second. I fussed a lot over the size that I should make these notches, and worried a lot about strength, because I knew that I needed it to be strong and therefore kind of have some bulk to it, so that when you pulled up it wouldn't just snap right off. But I didn't want to make it too bulky, because therefore it would make the size of the box too bulky. So I ended up making it about 3/16 inch thick, and basically about 1/4 inch of the notch width. This ended up keeping the box relatively not as bulky, but led to it having enough strength that you're not going to crack the lid when you lift the box. With the notches cut, I could then lay out where these locking pieces would go on the side of the box. These lock pieces are actually recessed into the side of the box. Here you can see a good shot of how the notches are laid out so that the locking notch is going to overlap with the notch in the lid. It may not make a lot of sense right now, but I have another good shot that will show this working well. What I'm doing here is cutting out a dado that will be the exact same width as the lock on one of the side pieces. This is the side piece that will be free moving and is what will slide the lock back and forth. Since it's being recessed into the side of the box, this piece needs to be the exact same width so that when you move it, it also moves the locking piece. Again, there's a shot coming up that will show all the interior workings of the lock working as they should. That'll hopefully give a better idea of what's going on here. With the dado cut done, I could then use my router plane to cut out the space that the lock would move into when you unlock it. This required two steps. It required one, using my router plane to hog out most of the waste, and then going in with my 1/4-inch chisel to cut out the waste that would make up the notch in the lid. Finally, here's the shot I promised that will hopefully make the whole interior locking mechanism make sense. So as you can see, I have the piece that's connected to the lock that's free moving, and you can slide it to the right to unlock it and slide it back to lock it. Now I can move on to one of the more stressful parts of this project, and now is cutting the push piece down. I needed to cut this piece in half so that there would be space for the piece to get pushed into the wall and allow the lock piece to slide over. Again, this will all make sense in a shot coming up. But for now, no, it was stressful because if I screwed this up, then the continuous grain piece wouldn't make sense and I would basically have to start the whole project all over. Thankfully, it turned out okay, and I was pretty happy with how it turned out. Now that that stressful part was over, I could glue a backing piece onto this push button. The backing piece and the subsequent grooves that I'm going to cut out in a second will prevent the button from protruding too far from the side, but instead sit flush with the side when the spring pushes on it. Again, I'll have another shot showing how this works later on. With the backer piece glued on, I could then take a spring from a mechanical pencil, cut it in half, and then use super glue to adhere it to the push button. I was actually amazed and thankful that this worked out because I had no clue where I would go to find a spring that would be as small as I needed it to be. Here I'm cutting out the little recesses I talked about a second ago. These are the recesses that the back piece will sit up against. Not only is this going to help prevent the push button from flying out too far and therefore not sitting flush with the rest of the side, but it will also help in making sure that after you've pushed the push button, that it will reset back to where it needs to be. With the recesses cut, you can now see how the whole push button will sit within the sidewall. The whole concept worked great, but I was a little bummed that the button is as visible as it is. But what are you going to do about it? Now that I had the push button almost done, I could move on to cutting a notch out of the moving lock piece. This notch will allow the lock piece to slide over once the button has been pushed. Again, I have a little shot coming up that will show this working. As I'm cutting this little notch, I'll also mention that all throughout this project I was pretty nervous about messing things up, which would have been super unfortunate. It felt so stressful because of the fact that in order to get the look I was going for with having the cut lines hidden, I needed the grain to match perfectly. And so if I screwed up 1 or 4 pieces on one side, I'd have to redo that entire side, and as you can maybe guess, working on just one side took quite a long time. So it made me super anxious anytime I went to make delicate cuts like this. Also, quick tip, You should never do what I'm doing here with having my fingers in line with the direction I'm pushing my chisel. One small slip and that chisel could leave a really nasty gouge in my finger. I always try to be mindful of this, but I guess I wasn't thinking at this point. And here you can see the importance of that little notch when the button is pushed down. It allows this middle locking piece to slide over nicely. I then moved on to building the interior portion of the box. I'm going to kind of breeze over this part because most of it you've already seen and it's not all that entertaining, but I will mention that the interior box wasn't just for a contrasting nice look. It was necessary so that the spring of the push button would have a wall it could push against and therefore be able to spring back in place. It also allowed the whole locking mechanism part to be almost hidden away so that all you see when you open the box is a clean interior with the little lock sticking up. And of course, I think it does add a nice finished look with the contrasting walnut and maple. With the interior box finished, I can move on to the glue up, which like most things with this project was pretty complicated and involved multiple steps. The first thing I had to do was glue up the bottommost pieces, which is what I'm doing right here. And while that was drying, I could then glue in the locking pieces to the sides of the box that are free moving. And while those locking pieces were drying, I could then glue up the interior box. This is the bottom of the interior box only being glued up. Then while that was drying, I could glue the very bottom of the box to the bottom pieces of the box. At that same time, I could then glue the bottom of the interior box onto the bottom of the outside walnut box. Next, I took the interior box sides that had finished drying and glued those to the bottom pieces I just glued up. And while that was drying, I could then glue together the top side pieces. These pieces will sandwich the free moving middle piece that has the lock pieces glued to them. Before I could move on to gluing up the rest, I needed to drill a recess into the interior box to allow space for the spring of the push button to retract. And here you can see a good shot of how those recesses I cut previously prevent the push button from shooting off. And now for the point of no return. What I'm doing here is applying glue to the top pieces only that will then get glued to the interior box. But as you can see, I need to have the middle free moving lock pieces in place, because the top pieces are what keep the middle pieces from falling off the box, since the locking piece is recessed behind the top piece. So there was no other way to put in the middle pieces after the top pieces had been glued on, so I needed to do it all at the same time. Thankfully, it all went off without a hitch, which I was very thankful for. Finally, nearing the home stretch, I could glue together the lid side pieces, then glue on the top of the lid to sit flush with the side pieces, and lastly, glue in the interior maple pieces that may or may not have been necessary, and then I was finally finished with the whole glue up. All that was left was the little touch-ups of any project. For this project, it was cleaning up some of the glue up, then putting a roughly 45-degree bevel on the top of the lid to give the box some more style. And lastly, put some finish on it, and it was all good to go. So there you go, that's a little look into what it took to build this puzzle box. This was a really fun project for me to design and work on. It by far was the most complicated project I've ever worked on. Just the little cuts, the importance of getting things square, making boxes is just really hard. And so it was really fun to kind of stretch my skills in that way. Once again, I love the design of it. I think something I was going for was a solution that didn't require any additional accessories like a magnet, that you'd need to kind of slide across something to unlock some portion of the box as a first step to open it. I really liked that I found some solution that had this spring push button. So happy with that. One thing I was not happy with kind of the final product, it's just a little not as clean as I was hoping for. You know, there's gaps in it that I was hoping wouldn't be there. In my head, the final product that I envisioned would kind of look like this side, but even cleaner, with not being able to see these kind of middle pieces at all, or even the lid of the box and it open, that you just see one solid piece of wood. But, you know, still finished it. It still works, which I'm always happy when my ideas work, and so I am happy with it. Maybe I'll try to, you know, make another one someday that's a little cleaner, but for now I'm just going to be happy. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Something I would love to know is just what you think of the box overall, and also what you think of kind of the voiceover with me sharing my thoughts about, you know, what I was doing and the build process. Doing something a little different from just the sounds of the shop, with, you know, text overlay of what I was doing, and would love to know what you think about hearing kind of more of my thoughts with the build process. Also, hit that like button if this is something you like. That really helps me out, helps this video get seen by others. And also, you know, if you think this video earned it, I would love if you hit that subscribe button. I'm working my way towards 1,000 subscribers. That's a little goal I have, is just to reach that 1,000 subscriber mark. And so, almost there, and love for you to help me out in that way. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.